Hello and welcome to this walkthrough of PredictHQ's data science documentation for live TV events. I'm Andrew and I'm one of the data scientists at PredictHQ. This is the first of a three-part series for live TV events where we'll walk through the data science documentation. We're going to start at the PredictHQ technical documentation webpage. And if you look on the left-hand side in this menu, we're going to go to the data science section and we're going to go to live TV events. We're going to be adding some more sections in the coming weeks to cover some of our other categories. On this landing page, you can then see the three links to the main three parts that we're going to talk through in these videos. So the first part is all about understanding how to query our API to get the raw data back from the broadcasts API endpoint. The second part is all about understanding and exploring the data. And the third part is then feature engineering, thinking about how to potentially aggregate the data and how to create features to be able to use in your forecasting models to improve your forecasting accuracy. The data science guides take the format of Jupyter notebooks, and if we follow through the link to the first one, you can see that this is rendered in HTML on this web page. If you want, you can obviously just go through and read the rendered version and copy out sections that you find particularly useful to you. Alternatively, you can go to the link up here in the right-hand corner and copy down the notebooks from GitHub. Or you can also open them directly into Colab and run them straight away in your browser. And that's what we're going to do for this tutorial to make it nice and easy to follow along. So once we're in the first notebook within Colab, we can see what is to come throughout this notebook. And really, the main aim of this notebook is to get as quickly as possible to this output data frame section. Okay, and so the output data frame is going to be in the format of a pandas data frame, and it's going to have all of the kind of raw data, but with the columns for the features that are most important for you to kind of understand and be able to use when you want to forecast. And I'm going to really just take you through these sections before that to just hopefully help to explain anything that you might need to know to be able to run this as easily as possible. If we are using Colab, this section, as it says in the text, you want to uncomment and execute. And as soon as you start executing any notebook that's not authored by Google, you will get this warning. So obviously it's written by ourselves. And once this section of code is executed, it will have cloned down the repository where our data science docs are stored. And we can then have a look at those in the file system on the left hand side. Okay, that's now run. So we can refresh the file system over here and we can see the cloned documentation sections. We can see live TV events. We can see the three notebooks and a folder with data. And so that has some example data which we might use in part 2. And so we'll come to that later. There's also a requirements text file here. So if you are downloading and running these on your own system, then you will need to make sure that the required libraries are installed. I'll be honest, there's no particularly unusual libraries that we use within this set of tutorials. They're actually mostly really common Python libraries. The only thing that's maybe unusual is PredictHQ. So that's going to give you access to our SDK, which will allow us to really easily query the API. Okay, so let's just go through the different sections of the notebook, and I'm going to call out anything that I think maybe just needs a little bit of extra information. The first section is where you set your access token. And so if you haven't already set your access token or created an access token, you'll need to go and create one, and I've provided a link here. I'm not going to talk through that in this tutorial, but please go and do that now if you haven't already. It's perhaps just worth quickly mentioning, if you've got an access token that you've used with our events endpoint, but you set that up quite a while ago or before we'd released the broadcasts endpoint, then you'll need to create a new access token that will have access to the broadcasts scope. So that's just a heads up on that one. And so once you've got your access token, you want to just come in and replace that in here. And that'll allow you to then initialize your client to query the SDK. Okay, so the next section has a little bit of information about what the broadcast endpoint actually returns. And so what it returns is it returns at the broadcast level sports broadcasts for these leagues in the US, and it provides the information at the county level. So we provide a viewership prediction down to the county level for each of those broadcasts. The next section provides a couple of support functions, and these are simply functions to help you really easily transform some of the data that's returned direct from the API into a format that you want to use. One thing I want to explain in this section is that each broadcast obviously relates to a physical sports event, and that sports event might be happening at a stadium somewhere else in the country. And so when we return the information about the particular broadcast, we also return the information about the specific event. And some of the information that we provide against the specific physical event is also relevant to the broadcast. And so this first function just helps you extract some of that information from the nested information that's associated with the physical event. So we want to extract what the actual sport is, and we also want to extract what the actual league is of the broadcast. The next section is all about converting the time zone, and this is particularly relevant to a PredictHQ feature called predicted end time. Now, the predicted end time is something that we predict for physical sports events. We predict when we expect them to finish. Now, if you have a physical event going on in a different time zone to where your broadcast is, if you want to use the predicted end time of the event as a proxy for the predicted end time of the broadcast, then you'll need to convert it to the time zone of the location of the broadcast. And so this function helps you to do that. The next section is all about setting the parameters for the SDK, which will help you to really easily query the API. And we set up a parameters dictionary, and then we set some of the key parameters. So the first one we look at is PHQ viewership, and this allows you to restrict which broadcasts are returned based on the number of predicted viewers. And so this setting here would say, don't return broadcasts with less than 100 as a predicted viewership. Limit is just something that we set to try and help the speed of execution of large data sets. So for large data sets, we suggest setting that to its maximum, which is 500. Right, location. This is probably the most important part of this whole notebook that I'm going to talk through. And this is how you set the location of interest for broadcasts to your location of interest. So what I was saying earlier is that broadcasts are provided at the county level, and each county has a place ID associated to it. Now, if you don't know the ID for the county of interest that you care about, then the other option is to use a latitude and longitude. And so depending on which of those pieces of information you have, you can either set the location place ID or you can set the location origin. I've got an appendix at the bottom of this notebook as well, which will help you get a link between the FIPS code and the place ID, if indeed it's actually FIPS codes that you have associated to your data. I provide a couple of example county IDs here. If indeed you don't quite know where it is you want to query for yet, you could maybe have a go with one of these that shows you somewhere like Chicago or Los Angeles. I think just worth mentioning, so the latitude and longitude can be any latitude and longitude, and it will then return for you the county information for the county that latitude and longitude is within. So that's kind of just hopefully explains that option there. Okay, so time limits. Time limits is just saying what is the period of time that I want to return broadcasts for. So that should be fairly self-explanatory. Just quickly worth noting that you can also set the time zone at which that refers to. And this is only really relevant if you're really concerned about broadcasts at the very edge of your time zone, your time period, making sure you get the correct ones, because it's at that point where if they're in the wrong time zone, they may slightly miss out on your period. But for the most part, your return data set would be the same even if you don't specify that setting. Okay, and then there's an example of what the parameters dictionary might look like once you've set some of the main parameters. The next section is then where you can come in and sort of customize to your own problem. So we give you the two options to either set the place IDs in a list or the latitude and longitude locations in a list. And these are going to be the list of locations that you are then going to query from the SDK. And for each one, they're going to then provide the county broadcast information for the county at which that location either is, or the location or the county with which that latitude and longitude is within. You can also here change your start and end date to whatever period of time you are interested in. And obviously you might want to put the end date into the future so that you can actually use this for forecasting into the future. Okay, the next code block is basically where everything happens. So we now reset the dictionary, the parameters dictionary, to the main settings that we want. And then you have the option to either comment out a couple of lines here. So you can either choose to loop through your list of place IDs, or to loop through your list of latitude and longitudes. So the only thing is worth noting is that you need to make sure you therefore comment or uncomment the correct one of these two lines. So if you're going through the latitude and longitudes, you want to set the location origin. And if you are looping through the list of place IDs, you want to set the place ID parameter. It then calls the SDK, you get the results back, and it converts it into a pandas data frame. The rest of this code block is simply pulling out the key information that's maybe nested in some of the fields into its own columns. So for example, using those support functions I talked about earlier to pull out, say, sport, to pull out the league, and we pull out some of the other important features as well that you probably want to pay attention to. We also then calculate a couple of simple features such as duration of each broadcast. The results are then saved to a CSV, and you'll be able to find those over here in the data folder. But there you go, right? We've now been able to query the SDK for a location of interest to us, for a time period we care about, and we've managed to return the results with all the key information in sort of the correct columns into a pandas data frame. So we've reached our output, we've reached this output data frame. There's then some information about which columns refer to the physical event that I was talking about and which refer to the broadcast. Obviously you can use some of the features that relate to the physical broadcast, but it's just worth bearing in mind that that some of them do specifically relate to the physical broadcast. Sorry, the physical event rather than the broadcast. And here at the bottom you then have, obviously you can just explore that data frame that you've just created, have a look at some of the columns, become familiar and comfortable with what it is that the API returns. So, an obvious column here is the PHQ viewership for each broadcast. And then the appendix is what I was talking about earlier to provide the FIPS lookup. And so that is the end of the first video. It's the end of part 1, and hopefully now you've been able to very quickly and easily query our API for live TV events and extract the data into a pandas data frame and save it to CSV. In the next video and in part 2 of the data science docs, we are going to look at data exploration, and we're going to learn a little bit about what the data shows and some of the really cool features.